Hi, and welcome back to Perspectives. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce you to procedural criminal law. In our last lecture, we discussed substantive criminal law. And substantive criminal law, if you remember, defines the actions that are criminal and stipulates the punishments to be imposed. Now, on the other hand, we have procedural criminal law, and it sets forth the rules that govern the enforcement of substantive criminal law. Let's talk about due process. Due process refers to the means guaranteed by the Constitution for ensuring that the government provides justice to all its citizens in all legal proceedings. Now, when the Constitution was ratified, there was actually great concern that there was not enough detail in regards to the protection of individual rights, especially concerning the area of criminal proceedings. So in 1791, the Bill of Rights, which is really the first 10 amendments, was added with some specific focus on procedural criminal law. Now, of course, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868 after the Civil War to include all people. So due process really specifically refers to your rights as guaranteed by the 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, and 14th Amendments. Let's talk about your rights that are guaranteed and protected by these amendments, starting with the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment provides you with protection from unreasonable search and seizure. It applies to all citizens, not just criminal suspects. It states that any evidence obtained illegally will not be admissible in a criminal trial. Now, there are a few exceptions, and we'll talk about those in more detail when we discuss legal limitations on policing. Racial profiling, by the way, is a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights. Moving on to the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment guarantees your protection from self-incrimination, your right to a grand jury, and protection from double jeopardy. So let's talk first about self-incrimination. You got it. This is, I plead the Fifth. Police can't compel you to become a witness against yourself. And this includes using coercion, torture, or brutality. This also applies to your spouse. Your spouse cannot be compelled to become a witness against you. Now, a grand jury, this right, it really only applies to federal courts. The Supreme Court has never extended this to the states. It's one of the few rights that are guaranteed to you due process that has not been incorporated to the states. Now, your protection from double jeopardy suggests that a person cannot be tried for the same crime twice in the same jurisdiction. But let's talk about this just a little bit more. Let me ask you a few questions. Can a person be subjected to more than one prosecution or punishment for an offense in the same jurisdiction? No. The Fifth Amendment specifically prohibits this. What if new evidence comes to light after the trial that proves the guilt of the defendant? Still, no. Can someone ever be prosecuted and punished twice for a single offense in any situation? Yes. A person charged with a criminal act may be subjected to more than one prosecution and punishment if the offense occurred in separate but overlapping jurisdictions. Consider a situation involving drug trafficking in the United States. The DEA, a federal agency, has the authority to enforce federal drug laws across the entire country. If someone is trafficking drugs across state lines, the DEA would likely get involved because it's a federal crime. At the same time, the state's law enforcement, like a state police department, has the authority to enforce state drug laws within that state. If the drug trafficking is happening within state borders, state authorities can prosecute under state law. Now, local law enforcement, like a city police department, can also get involved if drug trafficking occurs within their city. They're enforcing local laws and ordinances. So let's look at the overlap. In this example, all three entities, federal, state, and local, have separate jurisdictions, but they overlap in their ability to enforce drug laws. A drug trafficker could be prosecuted under federal law, state law, or both, depending on the circumstances. For instance, the federal government might prosecute the case if it involves large quantities or crosses state lines, while the state might pursue charges for violations of state-specific laws. And even local law enforcement might initially arrest the subject, who could then be handed over to state or federal authorities for prosecution. This overlapping jurisdiction allows for multiple levels of legal authority to address complex crimes that may affect more than one jurisdiction. The Sixth Amendment is actually packed full of guarantees for you. It includes your right to counsel, your right to a speedy and public trial, and the right to an impartial jury. Now, your right to counsel, it originally applied only to federal capital cases, meaning you were charged with a crime in a federal court in which the death penalty could be applied. Now, through a series of Supreme Court rulings, this right was extended and incorporated on the states. The first one, Gideon v. Wainwright, this extends your right to counsel to anyone. In Argersinger v. Hamilton, this extends the right to counsel to any offense. Doesn't just have to be a capital offense. And in Regal, extends the right to counsel to juveniles. Now, your right to speedy trial is an interesting one. You probably have known people who have gone through the criminal system. And doesn't it seem like it takes forever for their case to come up? Yeah, so it does often seem like it takes months and months and months. And a speedy trial generally talks about having your case held usually technically within 90 days and up to 180 if a defendant or a witness is unavailable. So the interesting thing is that you have to invoke your right to a speedy trial. So why wouldn't everybody invoke their right to a speedy trial? Well, defense attorneys actually prefer for you to wait. Witnesses' memories fade, evidence gets lost, police officers forget. All of these things work in your favor for a speedy trial. Now, the right to a public trial, this incorporates the idea that a judge will act in accordance with the law if they must hear evidence and make decisions publicly. Now again, this has not been extended to juveniles. Or I shouldn't say again, it has not been extended to juveniles. The others have. Also, your right to an impartial jury. Now, this was actually a right that was well established in the colonies, and it really continued through the Revolution. And we're really going to dig down on this one when we get to our section concerning the courts. The Eighth Amendment is a very important amendment, and it includes guarantees for protection from excessive bail and fines and cruel and unusual punishment. Now, when we talk about excessive bail, we're not saying that every defendant is released prior to their trial, that every defendant is afforded bail. That's not true. It does not require that all defendants be released prior to trial. But it does suggest that the bail has to be proportionate to the crime that was committed and the risk posed by the defendant. Excessive fines doesn't just apply to cash. It's also been extended to seized and forfeited property. Now, there is an exception, and that's civil forfeiture. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we start getting kind of to the police corruption side. This was an interesting legal move in the war on drugs, and it allows police to bring action against property. It's very interesting. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Lastly, cruel and unusual punishment. So this bars the government and its agents from torture through the infliction of physical or psychological pain. It is interesting to note that the Supreme Court has held that the death penalty, in and of itself, is not cruel and unusual punishment. Last, but certainly not least, is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guarantees due process and equal protection for all citizens, born and naturalized. It bars all states from violating or depriving a person's due process rights. It's equal protection under the law. It established the fundamental fairness standard. Okay, thanks for joining me. As always, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.